Maybe next time. Okay, so tonight we are going to study a subject of how halakha, how Jewish law relates to Jews who are not observant. That's the general topic. The specific halachic question that was asked to Chacham Ovadia, this was asked in, it tells the date actually, it says in Yerushalayim, in Taf Shin Vav, which is 1946. So this is this is 2 years before Hakamat Medina, 2 years before the birth of the state of Israel, and a few years before he went to Mitzrayim, actually, because for a while Chacham Ovadia was in Egypt. And so this Teshuvah is very interesting, was written initially in 1946, and was later, there are parts of it that he added in when it was published, because it was published later on. Obviously, the original Responsa was an answer to a question in 1946, but when they published the volume, it was already several years later, so he added some additional material, as we're going to see. He talks about his time in Mitzrayim, and the experience he had in the community in Egypt in the Teshuvah. We're going to see. Now, this is from a different book than we've been studying. Up till now, the main focus of our class has been in what's called the Chaveh Da'at, which is the simpler responsa of Chacham Ovadia that were given in his radio show. So they were more to the point. They could be read in, let's say, a couple of minutes if you know the language. Yabia Omer is kind of like the magnum opus of Chacham Ovadia. It's the much lengthier, more involved, more complicated, more written for scholars rather than lay people. But we can still access the basic points. This is from the first volume of Yabia Omer. And it's from the second section, because Yabia Omer follows the sections of Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, is divided into 4 sections. So when Chacham Ovadia wrote his Teshuvot, he divided the sections accordingly. So if the question was about a topic from the first section of the Shulchan Aruch, he would put it in that section. If it was from the second section of the Shulchan Aruch, he would put it in that section of his book. So the first volume of Yabia Omer, this is in the second section. So that's why if you'll see on the very top, it says Chet Yud Vav Dalet, which means Chelek Yored De'ah, Siman Yud Yud Aleph, because this is letters number 10 and 11 appear on this page from the section Yored De'ah. Okay, now that's just a matter of reference. So what we're going to get into here is he says, and we're going to start with where I made the little asterisk on the bottom of the page, where it says, and I apologize for the small letters. I actually have a much larger version of this, but it didn't copy well. It was too big to copy. Nishalti badin yayin shenagabo mumar lechalel Shabbat b'farhesia. So we're going to get into the subject of how we look at the status of non-observant Jews by taking a practical halachic question. The practical halachic question is as follows. The background you need to know is that in general, non-mivushal wine, this is why we usually use cooked wine, mivushal wine, because wine that is raw, that is poured out by someone who is not Jewish, becomes non-kosher. Now the reason for this is because according to the Torah, if a non-Jew pours wine as a libation to his or her idol, obviously it becomes prohibited. The rabbis, in extension of that concept, said that even if the Gentile is not necessarily an idol worshiper, there's another reason not to share wine with them, which is you start to get cozy with them, you intermarry with them, there are all kinds of other problems. So in addition to being concerned about the possible idolatrous use of the wine itself, we're also concerned about the social intermingling. And one way to put a damper on social intermingling is for Jews to say, sorry, I can't drink your wine. Not being able to drink your wine. And they didn't have so many, mivushal wine that we have today was very uncommon back in the old days. Now, it's more common. We pasteurize our wine. Many wines are mivushal, they're cooked. But in those days, raw wine was the rule. So to go to somebody's house and not be able to drink their wine could be, a major social liability, let's just say. So the halacha was, or is, that one cannot drink wine that was poured by a Gentile. So the question that was asked to Chacham Ovadia, and here we find the intersection of multiple halachot, is, what about a non-religious Jew? The Jew is not religious. So what's the difference? Gentile, non-religious Jew. So he says, Mechalel Shabbat befarhesia, somebody who publicly and wantonly desecrates Shabbat, he doesn't care about Shabbat. What's the difference between that guy and a non-Jew? With regard to the wine, so the question is itself very interesting. I don't want to embarrass this guy. He came to my house. He's not a non-religious Jew, and he poured a cup of wine for me and for him. What am I going to say to him? I'm sorry, you are a goy to me. Right? He's going to be insulted. I'm sorry, you're non-Jewish as far as I'm concerned. Because you're not religious. That's not very nice. We're going to embarrass him. So the question is, do we say that, listen, we have to be, this person is still a Jew. They might not be a religious Jew, but they're still a Jew, and therefore we should be concerned about embarrassing them. Or do we say, listen, but the bottom line is, this guy is as religious as a non-Jew anyway. Right? Meaning he doesn't, the non-Jew doesn't observe mitzvot, and neither does this guy. So why should I be able to drink his wine any more than I can drink the non-Jewish wine? I could surely not drink the wine in front of me. That's pride.
Is this? Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Is this talking about someone who is? I am against.
We're going to get into that. We're going to get into that. Don't worry yet. Okay? Don't try to second guess him. He's going to take every possibility. And this tshuva is 10 pages long in these columns, like this, with the two-sided columns in the tiny writing. So he exhausts every issue. Now, at a certain point, he digresses into a technicality in the laws of pouring wine that we don't need to enter into. And I'll just kind of give you a summary of what he's going to say there. We don't have to go into that. But what I wanted to focus on is how he deals with the issue of how we treat a Jew who's not observant. How he gets around what would seem to be a big problem. Okay, so first he introduces the problem. And I underlined the key phrases here. We didn't even start yet. How could you have a question?
Okay, so
yes.
Maybe that's fair. I'm wondering, what is our definition of a Jew who's not observant?
Don't ask anything yet. Don't ask anything yet. We're going to get to that. That's why I promise you. Just have to hold on. Okay, let's see his answer. He says, Terem kol yesh levaer ma shekatav maran b'shulchan aruch yoreh de'ah. The first thing we have to do is clarify what it says in the Shulchan Aruch itself. Mumar lehachis. Somebody who is an apostate, lehachis means he does it to reject the religion. Literally it means to anger God. In other words, he's in protest. He's saying, I don't want anything to do with this religion. Afilu ladavar echad. Even one mitzvah, he says, I'm against Judaism and I'm going to break this thing because I want to violate it. Oshu mumar la'avodah zarah. Or he becomes an idolater. In other words, this person gets involved in another religion. O lechalel Shabbat befarhesia. Or he decides to start violating Shabbat publicly. And he says, Dino kagoy. We treat him like a non-Jew. So that's a very broad sweeping statement. So there are many things we have to analyze here. And he's going to take them one by one. And we're going to see that just like he did in the previous teshuvah where he tried to deal with the issue of Kaddish for non-Jewish parents, he's going to slowly but surely try to eliminate every obstacle in the way of making this easier. Okay? So he wants to make it easier because look at the language of the question. We don't want to embarrass this person. This person came to your house, he poured wine, maybe you invited him for Shabbat, you want him to feel comfortable, and whoops, he took the wine that was not mivushal. Back then all the wine wasn't mivushal. And he pours it for you. What can we do? So he wants to find a way to minimize the issue. So let's see how he approaches it. So he says, first of all, Im ze min haTorah u'miderabanan. The first question is, this whole concept that we treat a Jew who doesn't keep Shabbat, and again, it doesn't say, when it says Mechalel Shabbat b'farhesia, it means somebody who doesn't care about it. They flaunt it. They don't care about Shabbat at all. Okay, it's in the same category as Mumar Lahachis, somebody who's doing it to rebel against Judaism. Okay, so it's someone who's openly, flagrantly desecrating the Shabbat. This whole idea that we put that person in the same category as a non-Jew, is that biblical? Is that min haTorah? That really the Torah views this person as not a Jew? Or is this a rabbinic stringency that the rabbi said, listen, treat this person with the same stringency, leniency, whatever you want to say, as a non-Jew, but really it's a rabbinic category. So obviously, if we can reduce it, whittle it down to a rabbinic prohibition, we're already minimizing some of our problems. Okay? So, and keep in mind also that the whole idea of drinking wine poured by a non-Jew is also only rabbinic, as long as he didn't actually pour it as a libation. I mean, if the priest comes and pours the wine for the Eucharist, that's a whole different ballgame. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about somebody who poured wine. You weren't here for last week for our extensive discussion of Christian theology, but if you are dealing with actual avodah zarah, that's another story. We're talking about somebody who just poured a glass of wine to say l'chaim. Okay, so it's also only rabbinic. So if he can find out that this person is also only considered a non-Jew rabbinically, So we have a window open. So let's see what he's going to do with that. So he says, "V'lichora yesh makom lehavir raya me'agmara Sanhedrin." So the first thing he does is he says, I have a basis to infer that maybe we can bring a proof for one side or the other. And what does he bring a proof from? He brings it from the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin. And we're not going to go through every proof that he brings, because as you can see, a 10-page teshuvah is going to keep us up till midnight tonight. But he says that the Gemara there brings a pasuk from the book of Yecheskel, the book of Ezekiel, that says that Kol ben Nechar Arel lev v'arel basar lo yavo el mikdashi. That's what Yecheskel says. Any ben nechar, which literally means any Gentile, arel lev, uncircumcised of heart, v'arel basar, or uncircumcised of flesh, cannot come into the Beit HaMikdash to serve. So he says, okay. The Gemara there says, what does ben nechar mean? Mumar la'avodah zarah. It doesn't mean literally a Gentile, because we don't need somebody to come tell us that a Gentile can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash. It means a person who accepted another religion. In other words, this person worships idolatry, and then he says, I'd like to moonlight as a Kohen in the Beit HaMikdash. Would you mind if I also come and serve? Because I'm very religious. I like religion. I'm into to different religions, comparative religion, and I went to one religion. I want to try yours. So the question is, can he come in? It says no. So v'imi tad havei goy min Torah. If you're going to tell me that a person who stops following the mitzvot, in other words, somebody who worships idolatry, a Jew who worships idolatry, and again, we're comparing that to a Jew who doesn't keep Shabbat or who flagrantly violates Shabbat, but let's say a Jew who worships idolatry is considered a goy min Torah, halama likra leposlo lahakriv, hare dino kegoy mamash. Then we could say, wait a second. You're telling me that the Torah views an irreligious Jew, a Jew who has rejected Judaism, was accepted in another religion, as not a Jew at all. And he's actually considered a Gentile. So why do I need any source for the fact that he can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash? He's not Jewish. Right? He's not Jewish. So why does Yecheskel have to come tell me that such a person who changed religions, who converted out of Judaism, is not allowed to serve in the Beit HaMikdash? If he's actually considered a non-Jew, well, why does he have to tell me that? It should be obvious. So he says, therefore we can conclude that it's only rabbinic. Then he second guesses himself and says, well, maybe it still could be that even from the Torah's view, he's actually really considered a non-Jew. But he says, no. In the end, he says, this shows us that we can conclude that it's only rabbinic. Now if you turn over to the next side, that in the end, he says, you know what? This pasuk, this proof is not such a convincing proof. Why is it not such a convincing proof? He says, because you could say that yes, a person who leaves the religion is no longer considered a Jew. He went to another religion, no longer considered a Jew. But the only thing is, once he's no longer considered a Jew, who's to tell him what to do now? Right? In other words, I am a Yisrael. I'm not a Kohen. I'm not allowed to serve in the Beit HaMikdash. But who tells me I can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash? One of the 613 commandments of the Torah says you can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash. You're not a Kohen. Okay, but if I'm a non-Jew and I want to come in, I don't have that commandment. I only have 7 commandments. It doesn't say in any of those 7 commandments that a non-Jew can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash. It doesn't tell me that. So if I want to walk in and do it, who's going to stop me? In other words, what he's saying is, maybe you would think that this Jew becomes like a non-Jew. So therefore, maybe he can say, I'm no longer a Jew. And since I'm no longer a Jew, actually in one respect, it's more lenient. Because since I'm no longer a Jew, I can walk in the Beit HaMikdash and serve in there, because you can't say that I'm serving as a non-Kohen. Who's to tell me what to do? I'm not a Jew anymore. I changed identities. So that's why the pasuk has to tell me, no. Even though you're not a Jew anymore, you still can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash. I'm sorry. We're not going to give you a benefit of being a non-Jew. Only punishments. We don't want you to benefit from it. We're not going to open up a new opportunity to you that you didn't have when you were a Jew. So forget it. But it doesn't absolutely prove either way. In other words, what he's saying is we're looking for a proof. Is this idea that a Jew, if you wanted to put it simply, is Judaism a religion? In other words, if I get out of the religion, I convert, I become a Buddhist, I become a Christian, I become a Baal worshiper, whatever it is, God forbid, some other religion. So now, all of a sudden, am I no longer a Jew in the eyes of halakha? So he says, definitely not likula. We're not going to let you get away with more stuff now. That would be too tempting. But in terms of benefits of being a Jew, are you out of the religion now?
Oh, I always told you.
Right, we always think you can't get out of it, right? You're born a Jew, you can never leave.
But we all,
Now it's certain, yeah.
as kids, they always taught us, like in school, there's a term, mechutz leklal Yisrael.
You can be out of the, for certain respects, but you can always come back.
Yeah.
But the question is, as long as you're out, what is your status? Do we view you in other respects as a Jew? So now he gets to a case where it really makes a difference. And this is a very practical case. It's actually very, very practical. So much so that in the Dayanut that I'm studying, this is an issue that comes up. So what happens with respect to marital law? Okay, marital law. And this is a big difference. So he says, "V'hinei yadua shenechleku hageonim bedin yavam mumar." We know that there's an idea of yibum. That if two brothers are, a brother is married and he dies without having children, that now the brother is supposed to marry the widow or release her from the marriage by chalitza.
She releases him.
No, he actually releases her. Yeah, he has to make a decision whether to do it. If he refuses to take her,
She does the spitting.
she does it, but he's the one who rejects her. Right? She's supposed to want to. So in the case of yibum, the question's like this. What if you're married to a woman, and you're a pious Jew, God forbid you die, and now your wife falls before your atheist or your idol-worshipping brother, who went off the path of Torah. He's an idol-worshipping relative. Okay? So what do we do with this guy? What do we do with him? In other words, do we go to this brother and say, listen, you have to either marry this widow or release her with chalitza, because he's still a Jew, and as soon as the married brother dies, automatically this obligation falls upon the surviving brother. Automatically. So what do we do with an irreligious yavam? And believe me, it happens, it happens. Because you have families where some siblings are religious and some are not, and one could die, and then the wife, is left, and the brother is not religious, he doesn't know anything about the religion, and they need to get him to come and release her with this ritual. So it's not so simple. But the question is he even obligated to do it? In other words, can she just walk away? Normally she can't walk away. She must work things out with the surviving brother. He either has to marry her, or he has to let her go. But what will happen if the surviving brother is not religious? He's a mumar, which means not just that he's not the most religious guy, he wears a knitted kippah instead of a proper, black hat. We're not talking about that. We mean that this guy is not religious at all. He worships idols. Okay, worst case scenario. So what do we say about that person? So there was actually a machloket among the Geonim, which means the Geonim we're talking about 9th and 10th century, going way back. This was a machloket. What do we do in this case? And Rabbi Yehudai Gaon said, you know what? The woman is free to go. This guy's not a Jew. You see, he's not a Jew. He became a Christian. He's not Jewish. She can go. And it was very controversial. But that's what he said. V'katav she'arashba tamea al Rabbi Yehudai bazeh. But the Rashba, a later Rishon, was shocked by this. He said, how could that be? We say, demumar afal pi shechata Yisrael. Even though somebody sins, he's still a Jew. How can you say he's not a Jew? V'kiddushav kiddushin. If he gets married, it's a good marriage. In other words, according to you, Rabbi Yehudai Gaon, that this is not a Jew, if he gets married and says, Hareat mikudeshet li, under the chuppah, the rabbi is there, he's directing the protocol, it's nothing because it's an intermarriage. It's a non-Jew marrying a Jew then. If the man is not really Jewish. In other words, we don't say that. So how could you go so far to say that? Are you really saying that this non-religious Jew is not a Jew? That if he marries a woman, they're not married? Could that be possible? So people said that's crazy. How could we go so far as to say that even if he contracts a marriage, it's not valid, it's like an intermarriage? In other words, if a complete Gentile walks up to a Jewish woman and gives her a ring in front of witnesses and says, Hareat mikudeshet li, like we say under the chuppah, it's nothing. They don't have to get a get, they don't have to get a divorce, it's nothing. But if a Jew does it, it's something. Even if the Jew is not religious. We say, Afal pisha chata Yisrael v'Yisraelu v'kidushav kiddushin. The marriage he contracts is a valid marriage. So how could you tell me? How could you tell me that if this woman whose husband died needs yibum, that we're just going to let her walk away because the brother who's not religious is not a Jew? That's too extreme. But what does that indicate? That indicates, hey, this halacha, this whole concept that the person who's not religious is not really a Jew, it's not so consistent. Right? Because you're telling me on one hand, in certain respects it seems like if someone is not an observant Jew of the fundamental things, he's worshiping idols, he's flagrantly desecrating Shabbat, that we say, listen, you're not a Jew. But in other ways, it seems very obvious that he is a Jew. Because we never say to somebody wants to get married, I'm sorry, you're not religious, so you can't have a Jewish wedding. Nobody would even think to say that. I mean, maybe somebody would think to say it, but they definitely wouldn't say it. It doesn't happen. People get married all the time.
What kind of a wedding is it?
No, I'm saying an Orthodox wedding. You never have an Orthodox wedding with non-religious participants. Of course you do. With the Rabbanut, it's the whole state of Israel. Everything is Orthodox, 99%. So, of course, they have to marry people who are not religious. So nobody ever said, well, I can't do the wedding because maybe, you're not really Jewish. Because, that would be extreme. And very politically incorrect, I believe. Yes?
So, could I, somehow get, a Jewish woman, be, under a makeshift chuppah, like my friends are holding up a talit or something, make that statement in Hebrew that you just said, and, then marry her without her consent?
No, she has to consent. I'm sorry, that won't work. A strategy, a noble attempt, but no, it actually has to be. The woman has to consent to marriage.
What did you just say?
Right. So,
kind of like a woman into marriage.
What does that mean?
That actually happened.
What?
That actually happened in New York. There was a girl who somebody came up to her and she ran away, but still there was.
Well, sometimes they question, was she complicit or not? But if she doesn't consent, it's no good. She has to agree. So, in any case, so they offer here some. So the question, of course, is how can you distinguish between the case of yibum and the case of marriage, the case where the levirate marriage, where the woman sort of falls into the lap, metaphorically, of the brother, and he didn't do anything. He's a victim of circumstance versus a contracting of marriage. So that's one of the distinctions that's made. That listen, if I go and I give a woman a ring, it doesn't matter who I am. I'm saying I want to follow the halacha in this respect. Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. I'm giving the ring. Okay, but in any other respect, I'm just a passive bystander. So my brother passed away and left me a woman. I'm not in the religion. But if I go and I contract the marriage, it's a different story. I wanted it. I did an action. But this general approach of, in any case, in other words, that's the extreme view in one side. That's the view of Rabbi Yehudai Gaon. Rabbi Yehudai Gaon, living in the Gaonic times, we're talking about 1,000 years ago, said a person who is not observant at all, he completely is out of the picture, he's worshiping idols, that person's not Jewish, and maybe we could say that if he marries a woman, anything he does that he wants to be an act of a Jewish practice could be valid. But he himself is not looked at by default as a Jew. So if his brother would die and leave him a wife, he wouldn't be obligated in anything. Okay, no obligation is going to fall upon him. That's Rabbi Yehudai Gaon's view, but that's an extreme view. So let's skip down to the bottom paragraph. That the Rambam and many other Gaonim strongly disagree with this and say that this is absolutely not true. And imken, as it says in the underlined part, en lavi raya mizeh shemumar la'avodah zot dino kagoy min haTorah. Bram bekushta she'en ze ela midrabanan. And he says, really, this is only rabbinic. Okay? It isn't min haTorah. This idea that, in other words, in certain respects, so therefore we can only be stringent. We can't be lenient. And if you're going to say it's rabbinic, the rabbis can make things more stringent, but they can't make things more lenient. They can't lessen what the Torah requires. So if the Torah says you're a Jew, the rabbis can come along and say, you know what? You're a Jew whenever that's going to impose a stringency on you, but when it's going to make it hard, when it's going to make it lenient for you, we're going to say you're a non-Jew. They could do that because they can make things stricter. But what they can't do is say the Torah considers you a Jew, even though you're completely irreligious and you worship a pantheon of gods. Okay. Although that the Torah still looks at you as a Jew, we're going to say that no obligation is going to fall on you, no restriction, that if your brother dies and leaves a widow, you're not going to be obligated in marrying her. We're going to exempt you from everything. They can't exempt you. They can only make it tougher for you. They can't go against the Torah. They can make the Torah tougher. So that's what Chacham Ovadia is saying here. He's saying, let's look at this as a rabbinic stringency. Because if we look at it as a Torah law, then we're going to end up that this guy can't marry a woman. Because he's not Jewish. Nothing he does is going to have any validity, even if he wants it to. If he says the bracha, it's going to be nothing. So,
Ovadia is agreeing with Rabbi Yehuda.
No, he's rejecting that. He's rejecting Rabbi Yehudai. Rabbi Yehudai is saying he's literally not a Jew.
But he also said he has no requirement to do a chalitza.
Right. No, Chacham Ovadia is not saying that. He's saying you have to be stringent on both ends. In other words, since this is only rabbinic, so if the Torah really views every Jew born a Jew as a Jew from cradle to grave, no matter what he does, so we can't exempt you from chalitza. We can't exempt you from anything. We can only make it harder for you. I can say the wine you touched is going to be non-kosher, because that makes it worse for you. But I can't say that you're going to be exempt from something that you'd be obligated in. That I can't do.
Rabbi Yehuda holds this.
Yehudai Gaon. Yeah. He says that you're not a Jew. Rabbi Yehudai Gaon. He was a Gaon, not the Talmudic Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. Yeah. So, on the other side, okay, he brings some other examples. Okay. But we don't have to go into every case and every proof. But the point being made here is that it's rabbinic. Now, if you turn to the left column on page Kuf Tzadik Gimel, where it says Ot Dalet. There are, by the way, 25 sections of this tshuva. We're not going to go through all of them. Don't worry. Val kol panim midivrei Rambam. Okay, he says from the fact that the Rambam is saying that from the words of the Rambam here, he says we see Muchach Shapir de Mumar Dino Kegoy Midirabanan Davka. Okay, because in other words, he says the Rambam treats the non-Jewish offspring, let's say, or the Jewish offspring, let's flip it around for a second. Let's say this woman whose husband died had a child, that child went and became an idolater. So are we going to say maybe now that she didn't have any children? Right? So no, we're not going to say that either. The Rambam says no, we don't say that. So the point is that we're not treating people who change their religion to act as Gentiles. We're not. He says, and you see that the mumar shekidesh choshishin likidushav. We see that even a person who's not religious who marries, we consider his marriage to be a valid marriage, and so on and so forth. And therefore, from the area of ishut in particular, from the area of marriage and divorce, we see that a person who is a mumar, somebody who leaves the religion, is still considered a Jew. Because you see from many halachic precedents that he can in fact contract a marriage. And not only that, what would happen? Here's the worst case scenario possible. A couple marries. While they're married, when they got married, they were very pious Jews. The husband becomes a heretic and he begins to worship idols. Okay? Very uncommon nowadays. Yeah, whatever. But he worships idols. Usually nowadays when people leave the religion, they go to nothing. But let's say worship idols. So, this person now, the wife says, listen, I don't want to live with an idol-worshipping husband. I married a good Jewish guy. Now he's an idol-worshipper. I want out. Problem, I'm not Jewish. I can't give a get. I can't divorce you. I'm not Jewish. What are we going to do now?
You're not married in the first place.
Right. Oh, so no, because when they got married,
no, but they're not married
he was Jewish. So you'll say, he became not Jewish, so now the marriage is dissolved, right? So there's all kinds of questions about this. What do we do in a situation where status changes? But let's say the point is that the way it's treated, from the way it's treated halachically, we know we don't look at any of these things. We don't ask the guy, are you religious when he gets married? We don't ask the guy, are you religious when he gets divorced?
Do you worship the Baal?
Okay. What?
Do you worship the Baal?
Do you worship the Baal? Do you worship any other gods? We don't ask him anything like that. We take him as he is. He's Jewish. Now, if you turn to the next page, so he gets into some other issues about what the impact would be of treating non-religious Jews as non-Jews. One of the things that would happen is, if a non-religious Jew, we know that if a woman has relations with a non-Jew, she can no longer marry a Kohen. That's one of the rules of Kehunah. What if she had relations with a non-religious Jew? Okay? He says, what if her husband is a Kohen who's non-religious? Uh-oh. He can't live with his own wife. What are we going to do? So he brings all these examples. He says, from all this you see. I mean, he quotes a source that actually says that. The non-religious Kohen is going to make his own wife prohibited to him. So it becomes reductio ad absurdum, we say. In other words, if you look at where if you take the logic to its extreme, many situations will emerge. Now notice, most of them have to do with marital status. But it's interesting. We clearly, in the area of marital status and Kohanic status, do not say that by virtue of not being a religious Jew, you're not a Jew. We don't say that. Now he brings here a fascinating thing on the bottom of Kuf Tzadi Daled, on the first side, from the Rambam's son, who was asked, what do we do with a couple who's completely non-religious, don't observe anything, they had a baby on Shabbat, and they want to brit milah on Shabbat? What do we do? So the Rambam's son said, don't do it. So that would seem to imply that he's taking a stringent view, that it's like they're not Jewish. It's like they're not Jewish, so we can't circumcise on Shabbat. Okay? So in other words, there were cases where people took a hardline view on that.
He's saying it's D'oraita.
What?
He's saying it's D'oraita.
Right, it sounds like he's saying D'oraita.
Was he saying that they shouldn't do it, or it's because they'll be Chilul Shabbat?
Right, but if it wouldn't be Chilul Shabbat if they're considered Jewish.
At the party, though. They may do
No, he's not talking about that. He's saying the actual action of Milah. Brit Milah. So don't do it.
I thought that was allowed to do on
Of course it is. For Jewish babies. But he's saying, in other words, he was taking a view so extreme that this baby's not Jewish, or is questionably Jewish because parents are not religious.
Yeah, but why have a break if he's not Jewish?
Exactly. Obviously they care about something, right? So that's, he's going to get to something like that in a minute. Okay, we're going through all of the what it takes him to get out of a little bit of the fog here. Well, we'll see. So he goes through this. He brings the example of the Rambam's son. He says, but on the other hand, we know that, again, he keeps coming back to this issue, that the marriage itself is certainly considered to be a valid marriage. And then he quotes the Bet Yosef. Shulchan Aruch himself, the Bet Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo says, that if you have a situation of a non-religious couple that has a baby, you should do the Brit Milah even on Shabbat, because they're obligated in every other mitzvah. So what that they don't observe some mitzvot? They're coming to do a mitzvah. Who negated them from doing this mitzvah? In other words, he's saying there might be certain respects in which we don't give them the full privileges of, being a religious Jew. But the fact is they're coming to do a mitzvah correctly. Why should you not let them do the mitzvah that they want to do correctly at the right time? That's exactly the question.
But that goes back to the positive action. In that moment,
they're showing their Judaism, so we accept it. Just like when, in the moment that they come to give kiddushin, to marry a woman, they're asserting their Judaism. They're saying, Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, I want to be a Jew.
It doesn't prove anything.
When they fulfill a mitzvah, they fulfill a mitzvah. He's going to bring a great thing from the Rambam very soon that we're going to see that kind of knocks all of this out. But he's trying to show the point. So in the underlined part it says, that we see from everything here that all of these rules are only a rabbinic stringency, that in certain respects we treat a Jew who has flagrantly rejected his religion as a non-Jew, but that doesn't mean that we substantively transform him into a non-Jew. So in cases where that would lead to a leniency, or that would lead to the neglect of other mitzvot that he wants to do, we don't let him off the hook from every mitzvah and say, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want. That would be counterproductive. Instead, we say, in certain stringencies, we're going to say he's like a non-Jew. So this is very important, because once you knock it down to the level of a rabbinic issue, you already have a lot more leeway for leniency. When it's a biblical issue, it's much more strict. Now, if we turn over to the next the next page. So he goes through some more issues here. We're on Kuf Tzadik Daled. Now we're going to turn to Kuf Tzadik Hey, where he went through stuff about Shechita. What's the status of Shechita? Well, we're going to go over that. Now let's go over to page Kuf Tzadik Hey, where there's underlined part. Ve'im ken lo nifleti velo rechokahi shitazo. We see in many areas he's considered like a Jew completely, even for leniency. Okay, he says the only way you can really make sense out of the uneven profile that the non-religious Jew is subjected to in halacha is by assuming it's rabbinic. Why? Because biblical categories are absolutes. Okay? There's no jagged edges in the category. You're in or you're out. That's it. There's no, well, in certain ways you're going to be this like a Jew, and in certain ways you're going to be that. That doesn't work like that in biblical law. Biblical law is very categorical. Rabbinic law, sometimes they made a stringency in one area, they didn't make it in another area. It's rabbinic legislation. So they're making that legislation one piece at a time. It can sometimes be piecemeal. It doesn't have to be absolutely categorical. So he says, from the fact that we see that the Jew who, let's say, is worshiping idols or is not observant at all is treated as a non-Jew in certain respects and as a Jew in other respects, we can infer from this that this whole construct is a rabbinic construct, because biblical constructs have a certain appearance to them. They're absolutes. Rabbinic constructs are human legislation, so therefore they can be applied in certain cases and not in other cases. As we know, we can apply things in one case and not another, and that's how rabbinic legislation works from time to time. So that's where he reaches point one. Okay, point one. Now what we need to figure out next is, hold on just a second. So step one in this tshuva we completed. Step one was showing that even the worst case scenario, remember last time he had steps in his development of the argument where he tried to first show, well, maybe it's not idolatry, and well, maybe, he kept downgrading, he kept trying to make the problem smaller. So that's what he's doing here as well. Station number one on the way to our destination is this whole issue about whether this Jew is a Jew. Okay, that's step number one that you have to realize. Biblically speaking, according to almost everyone, with a few outlying exceptions, pretty much everybody agrees this Jew is a Jew biblically. Min Torah, even a Jew that goes and worships the Baal on Monday and he worships something else on Tuesday, he's still a Jew biblically. Whatever we're imposing on him here is rabbinic. That's step number one. The next question is going to be, okay, what does he have to do to get that rabbinic stringency put on him? Okay? So we already downgraded it and said it's only rabbinic, so we don't have to be that worried. And then the question is, how bad does he have to be for us to say that rabbinically we're going to put some stringency on him, treat him like a non-Jew? How bad does he have to be? That's step number two. I guess you wanted to ask something, Mr. Katz?
Yeah, it's a Torah prohibition for a Yisrael to serve in Beit HaMikdash, right?
Right.
So what's the Havamina that the Gemara comes to have to restrict him? If it's only a rabbinic prohibition, then why would you?
He was saying on the thought that it was biblical, that would be the way to explain it.
The Gemara.
Right. But on the thought that it's rabbinic, so it's not even an issue.
So why is the Gemara even? Why would a rabbinic change in status?
I'll say that there's a special halacha that a person who's an idol worshiper, even though he's a Jew, can't serve even though he's a Kohen and a Jew, can't serve in the Beit HaMikdash.
But of course,
that's
if
what
it's only a
pasuk
rabbinic change in status, he wouldn't be able to override a Torah prohibition to serve in the Beit HaMikdash.
No, we're saying a Kohen.
Oh, go ahead.
A Kohen, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now let's skip down to step two. Step two is how bad do you have to be. So step one is even if you're really, really bad, you worship idols, you're completely, you don't even remember you're Jewish, you changed your name and joined a country club, you did all the right things, you're a Jew, you can't escape it.
Joining
all right?
a country club is like the sign.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm trying to think of the ultimate step that you would take. Okay? So...
they have Jewish country clubs.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they're called jails. But at this point, the place where the teshuvah is we've said it's most likely rabbinic, according to almost everyone. So that's step one. That we treat even the worst offender as a non-Jew. Now we get to me'atan navol nidon didan. Let's get to our case. What's our issue? Eftach b'divrei bahag. I'm going to start with the bahag. The bahag is bal halachot gedolot. also lived in the Gaonic period before the Rambam. Shekatav mumar la'avodah zara u'lechalel Shabbat befarhesia oseh yain nesech. That the person who worships idols, the Jew who worships idols, or who publicly, which is a way of saying flagrantly, in other words, he lives in a village. Imagine Tevia's village. There's one guy opens a store on Shabbat. What's this guy doing? That's what it's talking about. In a time where 99% of people, they kept Shabbat. This one guy is, flagrantly doing it. This person is because it says, he says, because when it comes to this issue, violating Shabbat and worshiping idols are the same thing. Okay, now we're again not talking about somebody who violates in private, and we're not talking about somebody who violates by accident. We're talking about somebody who flagrantly violates Shabbat, because we know that Shabbat and Avodah Zarah, they're considered the same. Shabbat is the affirmation that God created the world, and all material things in the world are creations of God. And idolatry is the belief that some created thing is actually worthy of worship. It's the opposite. It's the reverse. So Shabbat and Avodah Zarah are connected. Now, this is what the Bahag says. And then he says, okay, the words of the Bahag are divrei Kabbalah. He doesn't mean mystical Kabbalah. He means they are tradition. In other words, the Bahag spoke with the voice of tradition. This is what he said. This is a tradition that probably went way back. And he talks about a case that the Rashba brings about someone who every city that he went to, he would tell them he was that religion. Oh, when in Rome, they say, when in Rome, when he went to the Christians, oh yes, I'm a good Christian. He went to the Muslims, oh, I love the Quran, I'm very good. Every city, because he was probably a used car salesman or something, whatever. Every place that he went, he became one of the people.
Used cart salesman.
Cart salesman back then, yeah. So the question is, how do we treat that guy? Listen, he doesn't really believe in any of that stuff, right? He's just doing it. It's just a shtick. He's just doing a shtick. But a person who, he says, "Aval mumar lechalosh avodat befarhesia, o she'eno ma'amin b'divrei razal." Somebody who really doesn't keep Shabbat, rejects the Shabbat, and he does it multiple times, and he becomes he removes from himself the Torah completely. That person, if he handles the wine, it's going to become yain nesach. He's going to be like an idolater, and this is the source of the prohibition. Okay, so now let's look over to the other side. He says on Kuf Tzadei, now there's one problem that has to be solved here first. One other minor problem. We know this guy is still considered a Jew biblically, right? What reason are we prohibiting his wine? What reason are we prohibiting his wine?
He himself does Avodah Zarah, and he could use the wine from.
Okay, that's one possibility, right? One possibility is he's really making libations out of this wine. Right? Well, the fizeh yesh ladun shoel b'mumar leka lemehash b'shum benotehem. You're allowed to marry the daughter of this guy who is not religious. So what are we worried about his wine? Remember, we said wine was because of intermarriage, right? Shebito kshera sharia lechol Yisrael im ken en makom leosra ela mishum hashash lisuch hayayin vekevan de lahave ela miuta lo haishinan la. The thing is, why would we be so concerned about this guy that we can't drink his wine? Do we really think he's making libations? How common is that? Very uncommon that somebody's making libations to idolatry, right? Even if he is an idol worshiper, very uncommon, and it can because of intermarriage. Okay, so then at the bottom he says, "Shemikevan shemumar la'avodah zarah have mumar lechol Torah kula af al pi she'en bevnotav isur hatanud min haTorah kevan shedino ka'akum bechlal gezerat chachamim hu." He says again, this whole application to this guy is only rabbinic. Everything here is rabbinic. This guy, it doesn't fall under any of the headings that would be problematic. We don't really think that the Jew who converted to another religion is pouring libations to an idol. He's not doing that. And we know that you're allowed to marry his daughter. So none of the reasons for the initial prohibition on wine are applicable here. So why is he being involved? He's getting involved because the rabbis said, hey, somebody who lives like a Gentile, we treat him like a Gentile with regard to this. Even though really, deep down, he's a Jew. Now, so he's succeeded in trying to minimize. We're dealing with a rabbinic category of treating this guy like a non-Jew rabbinically, and we're dealing with a rabbinic gezerah of prohibiting wine of a person who there's really no concern about this person's wine for any real reason. It's all rabbinic.
Why is there a gezerah to not allow the person even in your house?
Well, that would be fine.
You're going to grab a bottle of wine and start.
How far are you going to go? Right. You-
Why are they
right.
socializing with them if they wouldn't
Why are they going to their house?
take care?
No, it's true. It's true. I guess that they understood the need for. It's like having boundaries. So, you can't tell Jews not to interact, let's say, or socialize with non-Jews. That wouldn't be practical in any society, but you could have certain boundaries to remind them that, listen, I'm a Jew, I'm different.
At the same token, you can't tell a person who doesn't believe in the laws to observe them.
Of course.
It's impractical.
Right.
So what's
We're only worried about their impact on us.
Involves a very theoretical.
Well, we're only worried about their impact on us. Like, can we drink the wine that this guy is going to bring to our house or serve us or pour us? That's the real question. So he says, listen, we're dealing with, this guy's really a Jew. We're only considering him non-Jewish for rabbinic stringency. And this whole thing about not drinking wine is also, even from a non-Jew, in most cases is only rabbinic, because we're concerned that maybe we're going to intermarry, or that maybe the unlikely possibility that he poured it as a libation. And now it's doubly removed because this guy's actually really a Jew. So he's trying to show you that it's a very remote situation. So because it's a very remote situation from many angles, we have room for leniency. And now he brings what really is the kicker of the tshuva, which really gets into the contemporary quality of this discussion. He says, he quotes the Shelot Tshuvat Binyan Tzion HaChadashot. Okay? That mikol makom leposh'ei Yisrael shebizmanenu. He's talking about in modern times, the non-religious Jews of today. Yesh ladunim en lehem din omer mutar. There's a concept in halacha of omer mutar. Somebody who says it's okay. He thinks it's okay. In other words, if you grew up, you know what the rules are of Shabbat. You know what the laws are, and you don't keep them. That's one thing. You're going against it. It's another thing if you grew up, you don't even know what it is. You grew up, you were told certain things were allowed. You're allowed to eat shrimp, just not at home. You have to keep kosher at home. But shrimp eating itself is okay. That's what you grew up with. So how do you know? That's called Omer Mutar. The person thinks it's permitted. Or they say, I'm a Reformed Jew. I'm allowed to eat pork. Right? That's what they say. That's Omer Mutar. I say it's permitted.
Absolutely.
Right? In their mind, there is no laws. There is no law. There is no requirements. So is that person is not rejecting a requirement. The person's not rebelling. It's not the same as rebelling. Rebelling is I know what the law is, I reject it. Okay? This is Omer Mutar is I don't even know what the law is. My mom told me that it's perfectly okay to have a Christmas tree. I don't know anything. Whatever. So he says, and even more. And here's the really fascinating part that brings in even something more than that. Because we could say, well, that's true for the Reform. And people who grew up Reform or totally secular, they don't know any rules. What about the traditional Jews who are traditional, but let's say they drive to synagogue. Let's say they work on Shabbat, but they're traditional in many other ways. What do? Ve'od sheyesh behem, this is fascinating. Shemitpalelim tfilat Shabbat umekadshim kiddush. These people, they come to synagogue Friday nights, pray lechu niranena lecha dodi mekadesh Shabbat, everything. They go home, vaychulu hashamayim ve'aretz v'chol tziva'am shalom aleichem, everything. They do the whole thing. Eshet chayil even. They have kiddush. Ve'achar kach mechalim Shabbat. Afterwards, they go out to the ball game. Okay, Shabbat dinner is over. Let's go to the mall. It's still open.
Or they work on Saturday.
Right? Or they work on Shabbat day. Right? These mechalim Shabbat b'malachot deoraita u'derabanan v'harei mechalel Shabbat. High time. Here's the amazing thing. So why is a mechalel Shabbat considered like an idolater? Here's where he gets into the meat of it. Because v'harei mechalel Shabbat high ta'ama shenechshav kemuman mepnei she'akofer b'Shabbat kofer bevriyahu baboreh. Because somebody who rejects Shabbat rejects the Creator. He's saying, I don't believe God created the world. It's nonsense. I don't believe in it. I reject it. That person, in other words, this person believes in God. He came to the synagogue. He said the kiddush at home. He believes in it. Okay? Umagam benehem. And certainly their children who grew up in a traditional home, they never really learned all the technical ins and outs of Shabbat. They just know there's a concept of Shabbat. So these people, though, in other words, you want to be stringent, but there's a lot of room for leniency here. These people are not the Mechalalei Shabbat of the old days. In the olden days, if you didn't keep Shabbat, that meant you were rejecting the religion. You didn't want anything to do with it. It was an ideological statement to violate Shabbat. These people are not making an ideological statement. They're coming to the synagogue praying Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Shabbat. They're coming for a 3-hour tefillah shacharit. These are not the Mechalelei Shabbat of yesteryear. So you can't compare them. They do believe. And obviously this resonates very much with somebody like Chacham Ovadia. Because what community is Chacham Ovadia ministering to? The Sephardic community. And if any community has many people who are what we call Shomrei Masoret, people who believe very deeply in God, they believe in the Torah, they believe in the traditions, they're just not that observant. Okay, it's the Sephardic community. This is the Sephardic community. People who keep Shabbat in their home, they have a Shabbat dinner every week, they have a sensibility and awareness of Shabbat, they might have certain things they don't do on Shabbat, but they're not exactly Shomer Shabbat. These people are not rejecting Shabbat by any means. They respect the Shabbat in their way. They respect it. Okay? And then he brings another example of this from another situation. We don't have to go through it. He talks about somebody who is, that a person who, he talked about a shochet that was bad-mouthing all the rabbis. So it's inappropriate. He's going around bad-mouthing rabbis. It's a chutzpah, and he has en lo chelek la'olam haba. He has no portion in olam haba. It's very serious. You don't want to be mevazeh Talmidei Chachamim. Putting down the Talmidei Chachamim is terrible. So does that mean now that his shechita, that he did shechita, it's not kosher? Because he did a terrible avera? No, we don't say that. Why? Because in the eyes of this shochet, he's not doing anything wrong. Okay, in other words, the person believes. He believes. He doesn't think what he's doing is so bad. He permits it to himself. So he says, whenever you have a rule that people who believe sincerely don't take that seriously, you can't use it as proof that they're not committed. That's the rule. That they're not committed in principle to the religion. Because in principle, they're very committed to the religion. It's just that they don't keep all the rules. For whatever reason, because they don't think they're that important.
So there's a framework of what's acceptable to society, the society that they live in.
Mm-hmm.
And years ago, a person who
worked at all
was an outlier. He wasn't part of the community.
He was a rebel.
Yeah, but today
it's a little bit murkier. Right, so we see a person, like I would say, we see the difference nowadays between a person, especially in the Sephardic community more than anywhere. You see a difference between people that I would say are religious versus observant. You can have a person who's religious. They're religious, meaning that in their heart they believe. They read the Torah, they believe it. They believe in God, they believe in everything. They believe in the they respect the rabbis, they respect the Torah. But they personally don't observe everything. Or many things, but they believe. So can you tell me that this person is a kofar? This person is a heretic. He's rejecting Judaism by not keeping Shabbat. It doesn't have the same meaning nowadays to work on Shabbat as it did 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Because nowadays, people who are very sincere in their Jewish commitment in other ways, and their commitment even to God. I'm not talking about some like. Secularist JCC concept of, commitment to Judaism. I mean, commitment to the actual religion, but in their own way, not just to the peoplehood of the Jews or something like that. They're really committed.
Is he going to cover at some point people who come from like super religious families and then...
Yeah, he's going to talk about that a little bit. So, and then he says that a person also, he says, that alma dehad hakofer b'divrei razal dino ke'akum haynu davka שהכופר בעצמו, אבל איכה שמעשה אבותיו בידו, אף על פי שהוא כופר בדברי רז"ל, אוהב כמור על כולה. He says also, even if this person, in other words, he's trying to say, don't look at the results or the action. Look at the context. Look at the context. So therefore, you could have a person, number one, who doesn't keep the laws of Shabbat, but really believes in Shabbat as a concept, and really believes in the Torah. You can have a person who doesn't believe in Judaism, but it's not because they rejected Judaism, that's just the way their parents taught them. They didn't know the difference. So now I'm going to take this guy and say, you terrible, rebellious heretic, you. No, he's not rebelling, he doesn't know anything. He didn't learn it. And then he says, let's collect some more leniencies here. He wants to build a better case. So then he brings that the Mechalel Shabbat B'farhesia, He says the person who violates Shabbat publicly, he says that's only ba'avodat karkaot. This is a very lenient position. Now we turn to Kuf Tzadi Vav. He says this is only a person who goes and works in the field on Shabbat. In other words, whose work is very public in nature. He goes out in the middle of the street and he starts digging ditches on Shabbat in front of everybody. As opposed to somebody who's working somewhere in the back of his house. So he says, even though many people don't agree with that, they don't buy the idea that it has to be a very public action. We can add that to our case of leniencies if we need to. That's an opinion. We can add, another lenient opinion onto the group. And if we switch down to Yud Dalid here, where he has the Ot Yud Dalid and Kuf Tzadi Vav, he brings an amazing thing. I think this is fantastic. This leniency is a leniency that is really would have broad implications for communities today if it were taken. Which is, he says, the Torat Chaim says, Teha kamashmalan, te'afalgav denafik b'farhese. He quotes a statement from the Talmud. The Talmud talks about a case of a person who was carrying spices on Shabbat as a necklace in the public domain, which you're not allowed to do. And when the rabbi came, he covered it. So they said that guy is still not considered that he's violating Shabbat in public. Why is he not desecrating Shabbat in public? Because when the rabbi came, he covered it. Okay, he covered it up. So what does that mean? That would be the person that, let's say, they drive on Shabbat, but they park, up on the block and they walk. Or, they turn their cell phone on when they come in the synagogue, because in the synagogue, I keep Shabbat here. When I walk out, don't ask me. But here, Shabbat. That's what he's saying. A person, he says that even though he only kept Shabbat because an Adam Gadol was going to see him, the rabbi was going to see him, okay, or it was a place or a situation, a circumstantial. What does that show you, though? He has a sense of Shabbat. In other words, he has a feeling that what's appropriate and not appropriate. He's not going to do it right in front of the face of the rabbi. So that is a sign that he has some respect for Shabbat, he's saying. So there are some who disagree with this. But he says, that is a level of Shmirat Shabbat. And some people bring that as a legitimate measurement. Listen, this guy's not a flagrant Shabbat violator. Flagrant means you don't care who sees you. But if you have some respect in some circumstance, that means you're still not so bad. That's why I would say, the kids who come to me and say, sorry, I'm late to my bar mitzvah class, I had to stop for a cheeseburger at McDonald's on the way. That's one level. The other one went to McDonald's also, but he didn't tell me. That's a higher level. That's a little bit better. He didn't say, is there somewhere I could throw out my McDonald's wrapper? Then he came, yes.
Can you remind me what Atal got means?
Even though. So, now we have another leniency is that the general category of Mechalel Shabbat involves that it was in front of 10 Jews who witnessed it all at the same time, and they were all themselves observant Jews. Now, how often are you going to have a situation where 10 observant Jews are standing there watching the guy violating Shabbat, and then came and testified in the Bet Din that he violated Shabbat? That's never going to happen.
So it was 2.
No, if you want to kill the person. But no, we're not talking about that. We're saying it to be considered in public. In public, it needs 10 Jews, and then who not only, and he says it has to be in front of 10 Jews, and it can't just be a rumor that Shmulik violated Shabbat in front of 10 Jews. It has to be that actually 2 witnesses came and said, we saw him, he violated Shabbat in front of 10 Jews. We don't administer any penalty for the violation of Shabbat, but that would make him be considered a Sabbath desecrator. Now, if that's the standard, pretty much nobody is going to be subject to it, because we don't have 10 observant Jews standing around watching us desecrate Shabbat, and if they are, we know that there are people who are going to keep our secret. They're not going to go tell the Bet Din on us the next day.
They could have had, we're all downstairs eating.
Right, exactly. We're not going to see anything. See no evil, hear no evil. This is theory, right? So in any way, he says, listen, I'm bringing this to show you bases for leniency. Because once we have this concept, we're already dealing with a rabbinic concept. And then we're dealing with this, the concept that a Jew can become, if he rejects his religion, becomes a non-Jew. And we say that a litmus test for rejecting your religion is public desecration of Shabbat. But what does that really mean? First of all, what does it mean about the person? If the person really believes in Shabbat, they just don't follow the rules of Shabbat. Or if the person has some sensibilities about Shabbat, some kavod for Shabbat, that they won't desecrate it in certain circumstances or in front of certain people, that shows something. Or if we set the bar really high and say, we can't really halachically call you a Shabbat desecrator unless you did it in front of 10 observant Jews and 2 of them came and reported on you officially to the Beit Din. Whatever it is, we have to figure out what's the definition here. And then he goes and he quotes a Shelot and Shuvot Minchat Elazar, who rejects all of this. He's a very hardliner. He comes in and he says, first of all, I don't believe this idea that that you should be worried, that you should say that, listen, this individual said kiddush at home and he went to prayers, so therefore he's considered shomer Shabbat. He says you can't keep half Shabbat. It's either, isn't that interesting that they had that even back then? The half Shabbat, right? So he said, "V'chi yesh shvita l'chati Shabbat." Is there such a thing as half Shabbat? Either you were in or out. So Chacham Ovadia says, I disagree with that argument. I disagree with it. He says, just because this guy didn't keep the law that you can't work on Shabbat, we're going to take away his kiddush? We're going to take away the prayers? He has something. He has something. Why are we taking it away from him? That's not fair. And then this tshuva also said, why do you care about it? Just throw these people out of the community already. You're saying, let's be lenient so we can keep them in the community. I say, goodbye and good riddance. We don't want you because you're going to be a bad influence on us. He says, that's not right. Absolutely not. This person, because a Jew, even if the Jew doesn't keep certain mitzvot, he's still obligated in all the mitzvot. And whatever mitzvot he keeps, he gets the sachar. And whatever averot he does, he gets the sin. And he quotes a Rambam. He says, he quotes a Rambam, a famous Rambam actually, that I always, I've quoted myself a couple times, but from the letter that he sent to the Jews of Yemen who were being forced to convert and they were all worried about this situation, famous letter, he says, even somebody who worships idols, like Yarovam ben Nevat, who was the worst king of Israel, even somebody like Yarovam ben Nevat, you just learned about him probably, even him, not only is he held accountable for worshipping idols, he's also held accountable that he didn't make an Eruv Tavshilin when there was a 3-day Yom Tov. Meaning, it's not all or nothing. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, you worship idols, but at least you could also put on tefillin. At least you could also not eat pork. In other words, every avirah you do still gets added on or subtracted. Every mitzvah you do is added on or subtracted. So why are you throwing the baby out with the bathwater? And he quotes a pasuk, a great pasuk here. He says that the Chachamim bring that, actually that's a little bit further down. First he says, we can't embarrass these people in public. He says, Im naskim levayesh lanashim alalu lalbin pneim barabim lasor hayayin b'magam. He says, if we embarrass non-religious Jews by saying the wine that you touched is not kosher, you're going to send them over the cliff. They're going to be gone. Maybe they had 10 mitzvot they were doing out of 613, they're going to have 0. So why not the 10? Why are the 10 not worth keeping them part of the fold, is the argument. He says they're still considered obligated in the mitzvot, as the Rambam says in that famous statement. And he says that he also says that nowadays we have so many different people, so many different situations. We have groups that completely do reject Judaism, and they are rebelling against the Torah. He says those people are different. Those people are different. But we're talking about people who are still within the community, and they're still involved. And he says, therefore, every rabbi has to look at the situation himself and evaluate what to do. But the general principle is, if they're in the community, we want to keep them in. We don't want to isolate them, and we don't want to embarrass them for their lapses. Now, if we turn over, we're going to do just a little bit more, because I wanted to get to this wonderful piece here that he has on Kuf Tzadi Zayin. So he quotes the Rambam. He says that this idea of kicking these people out is going against the Rambam. Because he says, and I underlined this paragraph, Ve'en ra'oi leharchik ovre avera u'mechalale Shabbat v'lim osotam. It's not right to take the people who don't keep Shabbat and they do averot and to hate them and to separate from them. Ela yesh lekarvam. A person should bring them closer, to encourage them to do the mitzvot. He says, and he quotes a beautiful chazal, says, beautiful statement of the rabbis, HaPoshea biratzon, kishiyavol bet hakneset litpalel, mekablin oto. When somebody who is very bad comes to pray, we accept him. Why? And we don't treat him negatively. V'samchu ala pasuk lo yavozu laganav ki yignov limale nafsho ki yirav. It says in the pasuk, don't denigrate the thief when he steals because he's hungry. Okay, when he steals to live because he's hungry. Okay, what does he say? What did the rabbi say? Al yavozu leposhei Yisrael shebaim baseter lignov mitzvot. It means when a person comes and listen, he's a bad guy, but he came to steal a mitzvah. His soul needs the mitzvah. He came in. Why do you make him feel bad? If the guy, we all know this, a guy hasn't been in the synagogue for a long time, everyone goes, hey, where have you been? What's he's not going to want to come back again because he realized every time he comes in, you're going to make a big deal out of it and be embarrassed. He just wanted to come in for whatever reason to pray. You should let him come in. What? I just saw you at McDonald's last week and now you're again. Leave him alone. Let him come in and take his mitzvah. So he says, again, since all of these issues are rabbinic, we're looking for a way to keep people connected. Now, if we skip over to the other side, I just wanted to read the other thing that he said about Mitzrayim. So he's again attacking this guy, Minchat Elazar, who was against trying to keep these non-religious Jews in the fold. So Chacham Ovadia again takes it up. He doesn't let him go. He keeps hammering at him, bringing the Rambam. Now he says, let me tell you something. First of all, you don't know history because he was saying the Karaim were different. He says it's not true. The Karaim lived amongst the Jews and they still tried to keep them part of the Jewish community. The Rambam says you should talk to them, you should engage them, you should treat them nicely, the Karaites. Then he says that V'yadati beverur bioti b'Mitzrayim. When I was in Egypt, this is fascinating. Ki harbe min ha'anashim halalu she'ovdim b'yom Shabbat. Many of the people worked on Shabbat. B'tzetam min ha'avodah nizraim shelo l'chalel Shabbat. He says, as soon as they left work, they didn't violate Shabbat anymore. Okay, so you'll say, so what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. V'chen enam me'ashnim b'Shabbat. They also didn't smoke on Shabbat, which is a very common thing among Sfaradim. Right? I don't smoke on Shabbat. I do everything else, but I don't smoke. I work, but I don't smoke. This is very common. Why? Because they said, listen, I don't need to. In other words, they feel, I need to work, I have to, I need parnasa. But smoking I don't need to do, so I'm going to skip it. There are many people who do that. Many people get up early to go to the earliest minyan. There's a famous minyan in New York City that's very early so that people could go out to work on Shabbat. So they could get to work on time. Very nice. They also cared about not cheating their employers. They wanted to be at work on time. But when they get home, they were crying that they had to work on Shabbat. They didn't want to work on Shabbat. They felt that they had to do it. And people like this, could you say these people are rejecting Shabbat? No. If these people pour you a glass of wine, you can drink it. In other words, these are people who really honor the Shabbat. They just find themselves in a situation where they feel that they have no choice. And he says that, for example, he quotes another tshuva that says, "Shamechalel Shabbat befarhesia v'nizar shelo la'ashen sigariot v'chayotze bazeh." Even a person who violates Shabbat publicly, but he doesn't smoke on Shabbat, you could say he's not really rejecting Shabbat. In other words, he's saying that even a small sliver of respect for Shabbat is something. He's not saying that that's how you should be. He's not recommending it. He's saying you can't say this person left Shabbat behind. ושלא אמרו שמחלל שבת בפרהסיה דינו כגוי אלא באופן שעושה יום השבת כיום חול לגמרי בכל המלאכות שהזדמנו לו להנאתו. Because we only say a person is rejecting Shabbat when it's completely a weekday to them. But this is not a weekday, it's Shabbat. We have rules. He says if he writes or he does other melachot for his work, we understand. He feels that he has no choice. Okay, so this is the main thing. And now let's skip all the way over now to on Kuf Tzadichet, the left side, the top paragraph with the long thing. He says, Umina, from all of this, since there are many who say that you need 10 people, you need to violate Shabbat in front of 10 people and all that, he says that you can definitely drink the wine that they pour. And he says, and the whole idea that we treat them like a non-Jew is only rabbinic, and this whole thing is rabbinic. So there's plenty of room to be lenient. And then what he goes into here on the next couple of pages, and we're going to skip to his conclusion, what he goes into in the next couple of pages is a different issue, which is when you have a situation where this restriction actually applies. Let's say a non-Jew actually takes the bottle of wine and pours it. Does the whole bottle become prohibited? Does just what's in the cup you pour it into become prohibited? In other words, he works out the parameters of the law, which we don't need to go into right now because that wasn't really the point of why we took this tshuva. But we're going to go to the very last page, Rish Aleph, in his last letter there where it says Kaf Vav. There's some more things that he says on the side about other views differentiating between somebody who does things out of desire versus out of rebellion and so on. But I want to just skip to the last little paragraph here at the very top of the left hand, before where it says Siman Yud Bet. Ela sha'anu ba'niyutenu matzanu smach lakel. We have found in our humility a basis to be lenient. Kishehem shomrei Torah u'mitzvot, when people are generally trying to observe the Torah, v'im kol ze nechshalim b'chilul Shabbat b'farhesia, but they're not keeping Shabbat. Now, what kind of religious person is not keeping Shabbat means, in other words, that they're connected to Judaism. They might come on weekdays. They're involved in other ways. We have many people like this. Bishvil parnasatam, because of their work, they have to do it. Al pi dat hagaon binyan Zion v'hagaon Mari Asad v'siatam mishlume emunei Yisrael. We consider them like, in accordance with the two lenient views that we saw earlier, we consider them to be like Shlumei Emunei Yisrael. We consider them to be good Jews. In other words, either because they really do honor the Shabbat in some way, on their level, they do honor the Shabbat, it's not like a weekday, and because they don't do it in an official capacity in front of 10 Jews who are witnessing them and who then go and tell the Bet Din that they're officially Sabbath desecrators. Since these two things are lacking, we're not going to treat them as Mechalelei Shabbat for this purpose. V'chen ra'iti ka'et b'shelot u'tshuvot chelkat Yaakov shelo lakel b'diavad b'achronim hanal uviyot sheikar din stam yenam midrabanan. And since this whole thing is only rabbinic anyway, v'gam l'kamposkim lo chashivu mar el midrabanan. And according to many, even if somebody actually did violate Shabbat purposely, explicitly to reject Judaism, or went after idolatry, that would only be rabbinic, since there are many safety nets here along the way that we can be lenient. So therefore he says, he says, therefore there's lots of room to be lenient. He says, I've written what seems right to my humble opinion. So he says, and may Hashem enlighten us. So if what we see here, just to summarize, this was a longer tshuva than the ones we've done before. But what we see here to summarize is, again, Chacham Ovadia is dealing with the realities on the ground, which is something that poskim have to do. And the realities on the ground that he deals with are really realities that we could say in many ways are typical of Sephardic community, which are people who are very traditional, who are connected to Judaism, who are believers. I've always said, bringing some kind of a program to convince people to believe in the Torah to Sephardic synagogue, you don't need. Convince people to observe halakha, that you need. But to convince them to believing they do. They all believe. So he's talking about a situation of that relates to the community that he served, which is people who are not technically observant, but in many ways very deeply religious. How does the halakha look at them? It used to be, in other words, if you look at on the books, it sounds like we measure a person's membership in the Jewish people by their worship of idolatry. Certainly, he doesn't even get into that, but by their observance of Shabbat, whether they publicly observe or don't observe Shabbat. And it looks like that's a litmus test. That's the absolute measure of this person's kashrut as a Jew, or this person's status as as someone who's a Jew. He says, but that's not so simple. That's what's on the books. But put it in context. In context, what did Chilul Shabbat mean back then? It meant rejecting the community. It meant being a rebel. It meant throwing off Judaism. Nowadays, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. And a person can very easily exist having on one hand a strong commitment to Shabbat, and having at the same time no commitment to the or minimal commitment to the technicalities of Hilchot Shabbat. So we can no longer combine these two things into one. So what he does, he in order to be able to get away with this, though, such an original approach, he has to downgrade it to a rabbinic thing. He says, listen, it's only rabbinic, we're dealing with a rabbinic status, and we're dealing with the rabbinic prohibition, and therefore, since it's all rabbinic, I can introduce this very creative idea. But the very creative idea has broader implications for because he gets into not just the issues of wine, he gets into issues of, do we bring them close, or do we say, get out of here, we don't want you? Do we want these people to stay in and stay strong in the Judaism that they have? Or do we not want them to be a bad influence on us, so we tell them to leave? That's sort of the sociological, the philosophical component of the teshuvah. Now, would this mean that Chacham Ovadia is going to say that when you sign a ketubah, you should have people who are not religious as the Eidim? No. He's not going to say for deoraita things, he's going to say you need to have the highest standard, of course. But he's trying to make a deeper ideological point here. First of all, about what's changed in our society and the way that people look at the religion, and how we should treat the people who represent a traditional lifestyle and not necessarily a halachically observant lifestyle. So it's a fascinating teshuvah, and this is going all the way back to 1946 and 1950, which makes it even more remarkable. Thank you so much for coming.